The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. This is what he said about our debt. He said the single biggest threat to national security is the national debt, and it's not sustainable. Now, this is the guy in charge of our military, did not say that Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Iran, radical form of Islam, he didn't say that was the biggest threat to our national security. He said our national debt is the biggest threat to our national security because literally we can collapse from within because of this debt. Federal debt, how did we get here? Well, if you think about it, we got here because politicians in Washington wanted to get reelected. So, and it's much easier to get reelected if you borrow from the Treasury and give money away and create new programs. So it's much easier to get reelected by doing that. And for too many years, we have had politicians that have just said, you know what? I know we're building up this debt. I know it's a problem, but we'll put it off for the future and for future generations. And now we're in the situation that we're in because we haven't had enough people with courage up there to basically say no, which has led us to this number. This is where we are, although if we wanted to get a clock that actually showed it moving and how fast it's moving, it would your eyes wouldn't be able to keep up with it. The number is moving so fast on how we're adding to this debt. We're actually adding about $3 billion a day to the national debt. This year, we're going to borrow 42 cents out of every dollar that we spend. So to put that in simpler terms, think of yourselves as a family. If you made $58,000 this year, that means you would borrow an additional $42,000, so you would spend $100,000, even though you only made $58,000. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that if you're a family, you can't sustain that. Well, if we follow the president's budget plan for the next 10 years, we're going to do this literally almost every year. And that's why everybody says it's unsustainable. Just to put this, all that mandatory spending I just talked about, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, right now, remember the slide where I showed you we were taking in about $2.2 trillion in revenue, that's taxes, okay? Mandatory spending equals almost all of what we're taking in right now. To fund the rest of the government, we're borrowing. The record deficit we ever had in the history of this country 3 years ago was $458 billion. That was the highest by far. And the last 3 years, we've now had $1.3 trillion, $1.4 trillion, and now $1.5 trillion deficits. The problem is, if we continue on the spending path that the president has put us on, we will be borrowing, or we will be paying interest, like interest on our national credit card of almost $1 trillion a year. That's why it's completely unsustainable. That $1 trillion will be more money than we pay on defense, more money than we pay on Social Security, more money than we pay on Medicare. The interest on the debt will be the biggest single thing in our entire budget. In the president's budget, there's $8.7 trillion over 10 years in new federal spending. Okay, remember the $400 billion that he talked about in cuts and savings? Okay, but what he forgot to tell you, there's also $8.7 trillion in new spending. And this is what happens to our federal debt if we follow the president's plan. Here we are today at about $14 trillion. Over 10 years, we will almost double it to $26 trillion. That's why that interest payment gets close to $1 trillion. This week, the House of Representatives voted to cut $61 billion to fund the government from the rest of the year. They wanted to cut $61 billion. And you heard all the belly aching that went off in the partisan differences and all of this. All they wanted to do was take it back to 2008 spending levels. That's all they wanted to do with it. Okay? And the reason they wanted to take it back to 2008, this is what's happened the last 2 years. Government has grown by 24% in the last 2 years. So they want to take it back at least, and this is just the discretionary side of the budget. If you count the stimulus money that was passed 2 years ago, government has actually grown by 84% over the last 2 years. So we want to take it back to 2000. I actually think you need to go back farther than 2008, but at least do 2008 so you can start getting a little handle on this deficit and this debt that we've been running up. And this was a quote from the President Obama's commission on deficit reduction. Called it the Debt Commission. Basically, this sums it up. America cannot be great if we go broke. You can't just cut your way out of this. out of this deficit. We do have to make spending cuts, and you have to do this in a bipartisan way. One party cannot do this. It is impossible for one party politically to, well, one, you don't have the votes. This takes presidential leadership, and it takes congressional leadership working together to come up with the political courage to do this. Because as I said, it's much easier to get reelected if you're giving money away. But if you're making the tough decisions necessary to put this country on sound financial footing, it is going to take courage, and it's going to take both parties working together.